We don't know, but we hope it's setting us in the right direction. And I think we sort of all know, at least we all know, and we all agree where we want to go. I mean, and of course, we might not always agree about how to get there. I mean, that is the whole point of living in a democratic society, is to have these debates and these discussions where all views are welcome and all views are open. And then hopefully along the way, we will have a consensus and not just only a consensus, but then consensus that leads to actual actions, because at the end of the day, we can't be looking for consensus forever.
I worry that the budget relies on zero increases in civil servant wages over the medium-term expenditure framework. And I am concerned because I don't know to what extent it will be easy from a political perspective to actually achieve this. I really think that this is a highly contested terrain. Fiscal consolidation is definitely still the goal from what we saw yesterday, and fiscal prudence still seems to be the target. And it was encouraging to see the rand strengthening in response to the budget. So it definitely says that the investors, foreign and local, and definitely the credit rating agencies are buying whatever that we're selling as South Africa. And if you were to ask me if we can deliver, looking at the skills exodus that the public sector has actually experienced, I don't know if we'll be able to deliver. And with government's posture of not wanting to meaningfully crowd in the private sector, I worry that implementation and delivery is actually going to be achieved.
That, the finance minister talks about a budget deficit, not a budget deficit, but a shortfall in revenue collection, well above 200 billion rand. And then he goes and gives the private sector a drop in corporate tax to 27%. So I think the two are counterintuitive. So just like the business constituency probably doesn't understand our issues pertaining to the wage bill, we would think it's counterintuitive to say that you've got a shortfall in your revenue collection, and then those people that are contributing to your revenue collection, you decide that you're going to drop the level of corporate tax. I don't even think that it went as far enough to even begin to quantify the amount of resource mobilization that's going to be needed to bring this economic recovery into effect. So the answer is, again, a resounding no. The budget didn't do that. So lastly, when your expectations are not met, you need to keep taking them down a notch or two. So I've gone down to the last level here, and I figured, was it even consistent in its ability to provide social provision to South Africans, just like what we promised them in the context of the Constitution? Well, to an extent, we can say yes, there's a significant amount of money that's prioritized towards social provision. But when you look at the current fiscal policy trajectory of debt stabilization, what it does is it translates into the erosion of social provision in the long run. I know there was a bit of a debate in the actual speech around the definition of austerity, but if you look at the fact that the concept of debt stabilization, what it really means over the long run is that you roll back, you erode on social provision in the long run. And that kind of sounds like austerity to me. I know the minister may not agree, but I mean, if it quacks like austerity, that's exactly what it means. So by now you understand what I feel about Budget 2021. And it's not just me, but the trade union movement in its entirety.
With the question, because I really don't think that asking whether the budget will save South Africa is necessarily very useful, because we do have to keep in mind that the budget is not a thing. It's a product of policy decisions that are made by policymakers, by government. And in many ways, I think we look to the finance minister for too much. He doesn't make economic policy. He makes fiscal policy decisions, but he makes them in a context of a broader set of government decisions. Why the private sector matters, and why this had to be a budget that spoke to the private sector. And there are two parts of that, if you like, the real economy and the financial economy. Lebo mentioned Michael Sachs, who's an economist who I really respect very highly. But I think even Michael Sachs, coming from where he comes from, is saying that the only way ultimately out of this fiscal crisis is growth. And the only way we are going to get growth, and the way Michael puts it is this, is if the ANC makes some quite unpalatable decisions for the ANC to encourage the private sector to invest, because you're not going to get it from the public sector, which really is in fiscal crisis with the debt burden that is heading towards 5 trillion rand over the next 3 years, and consuming 20% of all the tax, 20% of all the tax that the government raises goes to pay the bondholders and the lenders, which seems a pretty unappealing way of using our tax money. The first is that the finance minister opted largely to save, not spend. So the context is that compared to October, at any rate, government is doing less worse on tax collections, 100 billion rand less worse. So going into the budget, I think the big question was this going to go to higher spending, or was it going to go largely into cutting the deficit, sticking with a plan to stabilize the debt? And so signal number one that comes out of this budget is, yes, the government has held the line. It has devoted most of that, let's not call it a windfall, but that less bad scenario, less bad economic and revenue scenario, to sticking with the plan, to staying on course to cut spending, and so stabilize the debt.
Again, the government did raise some taxes through indirect taxes. So inadvertently, consumers are going to bear some of the burden through higher fuel levies. And given that we're going into an environment where the global or Brent crude oil prices are starting to increase, I suspect that we're going to see even further fuel hikes. So that means that while we've given lower income households some reprieve, the fact that our social grant payments were much lower than inflation, and the fact that there's going to be some sort of consumer tax is a bit of a worry. In a nutshell, or just very simple terms, we are taking on more debt to finance existing debt. And that's where the worry of the unsustainability comes up. But I do think that in the October medium-term budget policy statement, we'll probably see a downward revision in those growth rates. I just don't see us meeting those growth rates. And as you said much earlier, irrespective of the pandemic, even in years prior, we haven't really been able to get our growth rates higher than, for example, 0.2 in terms of annual growth rate in 2018, and in 2019, a lackluster 0.9. So there, we were not faced with a pandemic. And now we have, in effect, the pandemic simply accelerated our existing debt, fiscal or a debt crisis.
If we are serious about economic growth, unfortunately, there isn't any shortcuts to actually getting the economic growth that we need in this country. It is only going to be through the implementation of the structural reforms that we've been talking about.
Moving forward, there's a role for labor to play, business to play, communities to play, civil societies to play. We all have a role to play in this. If we're going to wait for government, we'll continue to have this conversation 10 years after today.
We can hold government accountable, because if we put into effect all of these measures, it's going to show up in GDP, it's going to show up in unemployment, and it's going to obviously show up in diversity of the products we put out as a country. These are things we can then hold government accountable for.
What I would love to see is the president surround himself with a core of people, ministers, DGs, and downwards, who are not only competent, but also buy into the agenda which he articulates. Because I do wonder if the reason we're not getting all these structural reforms is not because anyone's incompetent, but because some people are, the people around him are just answering to other interests, other ideologies.
Hope we will do more of this kind of thing. And yeah, all I've left for me to say, thank you very much and good night.